This is a real-life story. It's not dramatic, but it changed everything for the people involved. On the night of June 13th, 2008, in Orlando, Florida, nothing about the apartment complex on Timberline Drive felt dangerous. It was quiet in the way suburban places often are after midnight. Cars parked where they always parked. Porch lights glowed softly. Air conditioners hummed in the background. And beneath all of that, there was a sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't alarming. It wasn't even unusual. It was a faint, repeating noise, metal against metal, coming from somewhere no one paid attention to. A sound so ordinary that it blended into the night like breathing. Most people who heard it assumed it came from machinery, or pipes, or a loose fixture swaying slightly in the warm Florida air. No one reported it. No one documented it. No one thought it mattered. At 2:28 a.m., inside one of those apartments, Jennifer Jenny Hart Sock, a 37-year-old mother of two, was killed. The official timeline would come later. What mattered at the time was how unremarkable everything felt from the outside. There were no screams reported, no gunshots, no obvious signs of a violent struggle that neighbors could describe with certainty. When police first arrived later that morning, after a welfare check requested by a coworker who noticed Jenny hadn't shown up for work, the scene didn't immediately announce itself as homicide. The door was locked. There were no broken windows, no blood visible from outside. Inside, Jenny was found deceased. At first, investigators considered natural causes, then an accident. It took hours before the truth became unavoidable. This was a murder. She had been strangled. The early investigation focused on the usual elements: timeline, relationships, last known contacts, phone records. Jenny's sex-husband, Michael Hart Sock, quickly became a person of interest. The divorce had been recent. Custody arrangements were tense. But suspicion is not evidence, and evidence was thin. No weapon, no witnesses, no forced entry, and no one mentioned the noise. Neighbors were interviewed in the days that followed. Most said the same thing. They didn't hear anything unusual that night. A few recalled a faint metallic sound, but dismissed it as part of apartment living. Pipes knock, fixtures creak, elevators clank. You stop noticing after a while. The sound didn't feel connected to violence. It felt harmless. By June 20th, 2008, 1 week after the murder, the case was already showing signs of strain. Detectives were working with fragments, partial recollections, inconsistent timelines, emotional but vague statements. What they didn't know yet was that the most reliable marker of time that night wasn't a phone call or a message. It was that sound. The noise came from the garage area, where a metal security gate, installed years earlier, had developed a defect. When opened or closed manually, it produced a short, rhythmic scraping noise as its rollers passed over a warped track. Residents heard it often enough that they stopped reacting to it. What no one realized was that the gate's mechanism had a unique timing signature. It could not open silently, and it could not be opened remotely. Later, forensic analysis would show that the sound could only be produced if the gate was operated by hand, and the duration of the noise, measured precisely during reenactments, lasted 11 to 13 seconds, depending on speed. On the night of the murder, at least 2 residents independently remembered hearing that sound between 2:30 and 2:45 a.m. At the time, they said nothing. Because why would they? This is where human psychology matters. When people hear a familiar noise in a familiar place, the brain categorizes it as safe. Once categorized, it stops being actively processed. It becomes background. Investigators didn't ask about background noise in the early interviews. They asked about arguments, shouting, footsteps, crashes. They were listening for danger sounds, and the gate didn't sound dangerous. By July 2008, the case had narrowed around Michael Hart Sock, but not enough to charge him. He denied involvement. He provided an alibi, and for a time, that alibi held. Because the timeline wasn't precise, the sound, the gate, could have made it precise. But only if someone had thought to measure it. Months passed. Then, in September 2008, a new detective joined the case. Detective Jerry Demings, known for his methodical approach, reviewed the file from the beginning. He noticed something subtle in the interview transcripts, vague references to a metal noise that multiple people mentioned casually. Not alarms, not screams, just noise. He asked investigators to recreate it. When the gate was tested, the sound matched exactly what residents described. More importantly, its timing aligned perfectly with a gap in Michael Hartsock's alibi. The sound marked movement, it marked entry, and it marked opportunity. That harmless noise, the one no one cared about, had quietly recorded the killer's presence. But that wasn't the strangest part. The apartment complex on Timberline Drive didn't look like a place where anything irreversible would happen. Built in the late 1990s, it followed a familiar design: two-story beige buildings arranged around narrow courtyards, shared parking areas, and a central garage secured by a metal gate. The kind of place people choose because it feels safe enough to stop paying attention. Not gated luxury, not neglected either, just ordinary. That ordinariness mattered more than anyone realized. Most of the residents had lived there for years. They recognized each other by sight, not by name. A nod in passing, a brief wave while carrying groceries. No one lingered long enough to notice details that didn't demand attention. At night, the complex settled into a predictable rhythm. Around 10 p.m., televisions went quiet, doors closed, lights dimmed. By midnight, the only consistent sounds were environmental: the distant rush of traffic, the hum of air conditioning units, the occasional footsteps of someone returning late. And then there was the gate. Residents had complained about it years earlier, not because it was dangerous, because it was annoying. When the garage gate opened or closed, the rollers dragged unevenly across the warped track, producing a short metallic scrape. Not a shriek, not a crash. Just a brief rhythmic grind that lasted several seconds and then stopped. Maintenance logs later confirmed the issue had been reported as early as 2004. The fix had been postponed repeatedly. The gate still worked. It still secured vehicles. And the sound, over time, became part of the environment. That's how the human brain adapts. Repetition dulls attention. By 2008, the sound no longer triggered curiosity. It triggered dismissal. On the night of June 13th, nothing about the complex stood out. No gatherings, no disturbances, no police activity reported in the area. Even after midnight, a few lights remained on in apartments where residents worked late shifts or couldn't sleep. Jennifer Hartsock's apartment was on the second floor, overlooking the inner parking area. From her living room window, you could see the garage entrance clearly. Later, analysis would show that this mattered. But that night, no one thought in terms of sightliness or acoustics. Investigators would eventually reconstruct the scene with precision. They measured distances, sound travel, lighting conditions. They tested what could be heard from where. But back then, the place itself worked against suspicion. Because crimes feel out of place in locations like this. When something violent happens in a remote area, people expect it. When it happens in a chaotic environment, it makes sense. But when it happens somewhere controlled, familiar, and quiet, the mind resists accepting it. That resistance shapes memory. When neighbors were interviewed, many struggled to recall specifics. They could describe the general feel of the night, but not moments. They remembered going to bed. They remembered waking up. The hours in between collapsed into something vague and shapeless. A few residents recalled hearing the garage gate around the early morning hours. But when asked if it felt unusual, they said no, because it wasn't. One resident, Thomas Riley, who lived directly above the garage entrance, told police he heard the sound, like always. He couldn't remember the exact time, just that it was sometime after he'd fallen asleep and before his alarm went off. That range spanned hours. Another resident, Marissa Cole, who worked night shifts and returned home after 2 a.m., remembered hearing the gate as she parked. She assumed someone else had entered or exited shortly before her. She didn't see anyone. She didn't think to look. In environments like this, familiarity becomes camouflage. Nothing demands attention unless it breaks pattern, and on that night, nothing seemed to. The garage itself was poorly lit. A single overhead light near the entrance cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Cameras were installed, but only covered the interior angles, not the exterior gate track where the sound originated. That gap would become important later. At the time, investigators cataloged the environment quickly. No signs of forced entry in the garage, no damaged vehicles, no tampering with locks. Everything appeared functional, which reinforced the idea that nothing unusual had happened there. The crime scene was inside Jennifer's apartment, not outside, and so attention stayed there. That division, inside versus outside, shaped the investigation's early direction. They focused on the personal, relationships, emotions, motives. The environment faded into the background, but environments don't just host events, they record them. That every surface, every mechanism, every defect creates a trace. Most of those traces go unnoticed because they don't look like evidence. The gate was one of those traces, a harmless sound in a normal place, repeating often enough that no one thought to mark it. Yet that sound had constraints. It could only be made in one way, at one location, over a measurable span of time. Those constraints would eventually tighten the timeline in a way nothing else could. But at this point in the story, no one was thinking about constraints. They were thinking about people. They were thinking about intent. They were thinking about conflict. The idea that a mechanical flaw, left unfixed for years, could hold the key to a murder felt absurd. So it stayed unexamined, and the place returned to normal. Residents kept living there. The gate kept making its noise. Nights came and went without incident. The environment didn't change, but what had happened inside one apartment that night had already altered everything. And the longer the place remained unchanged, the easier it became to forget that it had ever been part of something darker. Because ordinary places are the hardest to question. And that's when things took a darker turn. The first person who truly heard the sound that night didn't understand that they were hearing anything important. Her name was Marissa Cole. She was 29 years old in June 2008, working rotating night shifts at a medical supply warehouse on the outskirts of Orlando. Her schedule was irregular enough that coming home after 2 a.m. wasn't unusual. It was part of her life, part of the rhythm she didn't think about anymore. On Friday, June 13, 2008, Marissa clocked out at 1:47 a.m. Security logs later confirmed this. She stopped briefly for gas, receipt time stamped 2:03 a.m., and drove straight back to the Timberline Drive apartment complex. She pulled into the entrance at approximately 2:18 a.m. This timing would matter later. At the time, it meant nothing. Marissa had lived in the complex for nearly 3 years. She knew the gate well. Everyone did. The sound it made was irritating, but familiar. A scrape, a pause, another scrape, 11 seconds, give or take. Long enough to notice, short enough to ignore. As she slowed her car near the garage entrance, she heard it. The gate was already moving. She remembered this detail clearly when she was interviewed months later. Not because it stood out, but because it explained why she didn't have to wait. The gate had been triggered before she arrived. Someone else had just gone through. Marissa didn't see a car exit. The angle made that possible. The gate track curved slightly, blocking a clear line of sight unless you were directly in front of it. She assumed another resident had entered or exited moments earlier. That assumption felt reasonable. She didn't look around. She didn't slow down further. She didn't feel watched or threatened. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of danger. She parked. She gathered her things. She went upstairs. Inside her apartment, she did what she always did. Shoes off, bag down, a glass of water, a brief check of her phone, then bed. She didn't hear anything else. No voices, no argument, no sudden sounds that would have woken her. That night passed into memory as uneventful as hundreds before it. When police first interviewed Marissa on June 14th, the day after Jennifer Hartsock's body was discovered, they asked her standard questions. Did you hear shouting? Did you hear footsteps? Did you hear anything unusual? Marissa said no, because in her mind, the gate wasn't unusual. She did mention it, briefly, almost as an afterthought, a passing comment. I heard the garage gate when I came home, but that happens all the time. The detective nodded, wrote it down, moved on. This is where the psychology of witnesses becomes important. People don't report what they believe is irrelevant. They edit themselves constantly, especially when speaking to authority. They try to be helpful by excluding details they think will waste time. Marissa believed she was doing exactly that. What she didn't know was that her arrival time, documented independently by receipts and workplace logs, made her the earliest reliable timestamp after the murder, earlier than phone records, earlier than unanswered messages, earlier than any confirmed sighting. The sound she heard marked movement at the garage gate between 2:05 and 2:18 a.m. That window would later collapse the entire timeline. But at the beginning, no one was asking that kind of question. They weren't asking when exactly the gate moved. They weren't asking who could have triggered it. They weren't asking how often it moved without a vehicle present. They were asking about people. Marissa wasn't a suspect. She wasn't a witness in the traditional sense. She hadn't seen a face. She hadn't heard violence. She hadn't interacted with anyone. So, her information stayed in the margins. For months, that's where it remained. The sound she heard didn't feel like evidence to her. It felt like background. And because it felt like background, it stayed there, quietly, while the investigation pushed forward in the wrong direction. As time passed, Marissa replayed that night in her head occasionally, not obsessively, just enough to wonder if she should have said more. But said more about what? A gate? It felt ridiculous. The brain resists elevating ordinary experiences into significance after the fact. Doing so creates discomfort, guilt, doubt, the feeling that you should have known something you couldn't possibly have known at the time. So, Marissa did what most people do. She trusted that if the sound mattered, someone else would notice it too. She trusted the process. Months later, when Detective Jerry Demings began reviewing the case file in detail, Marissa's name appeared in a list of interviews marked "No significant observations." He almost skipped it. Almost. What caught his attention wasn't what she said. It was when she said she arrived home, because timing is everything in a murder investigation. And Marissa's timing was anchored to physical proof. The harmless noise she heard wasn't just sound, it was motion, and motion leaves traces if someone decides to listen for them. But that wasn't the strangest part. The murder wasn't discovered because someone heard a scream. It wasn't discovered because of blood in a hallway or a neighbor calling police in panic. It was discovered because Jennifer didn't show up for work. On Friday, June 13, 2008, Jennifer Hartsock was scheduled to begin her shift at a medical billing office in downtown Orlando at 8:30 a.m. She was known for being punctual, not early, not late, just on time, always. By 8:45 a.m., her supervisor noticed she wasn't there. At first, no one was alarmed. Jennifer had 2 young children and a complicated custody arrangement. Emergencies happened, traffic happened, life happened. By 9:15 a.m., her phone was called. No answer. By 9:30 a.m., a second call. Still no answer. That was unusual. Jennifer was careful with her phone. She didn't ignore calls during work hours. Even if she couldn't talk, she would text. A quick explanation, a short apology. By 10:05 a.m., concern had replaced patience. Her supervisor contacted Jennifer's emergency contact, her sister, Melissa Grant, who lived less than 20 minutes away. Melissa tried calling immediately. Nothing. By 10:42 a.m., Melissa was driving to the apartment. This sequence matters because it establishes something important. No one suspected violence yet. They suspected inconvenience, delay, a problem that would explain itself. When Melissa arrived at the Timberline Drive complex at approximately 11:05 a.m., nothing looked wrong. Jennifer's car was parked in its usual spot. No broken glass, no sign of disturbance. The apartment building was quiet, as it usually was mid-morning on a weekday. Melissa walked upstairs and knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. Jennifer's phone went straight to voicemail. At this point, concern shifted into something heavier. Not fear yet, but a sense that the situation wasn't resolving itself the way it should. Melissa contacted the apartment manager, who unlocked the door at 11:34 a.m. The door opened easily, no damage, no forced entry, no signs of struggle in the entryway. That detail would later mislead investigators. Inside the apartment, everything looked normal at first glance. Furniture in place, no overturned objects, no broken items. The television was off. The kitchen was tidy. Jennifer was found in her bedroom. She was lying on the floor beside the bed. She was not breathing. Paramedics were called immediately, but it was already clear they were too late. Jennifer Hartsock was pronounced dead at 11:56 a.m. The initial assessment did not immediately identify homicide. There was no obvious blood, no visible weapon, no external injuries that suggested violence to someone without medical training. It wasn't until the medical examiner arrived that the truth became clear. Jennifer had been strangled, manual strangulation. That detail changed everything. Suddenly, the normal apartment became a crime scene. yellow tape went up. Officers arrived in waves, the quiet complex filled with radios, voices, and flashing lights. Residents gathered at windows, whispers spread. But even then, no one connected the crime to the sound from the night before. Because the discovery of a body pulls attention inward, investigators focused on the apartment. They photographed every surface, collected fibers, examined bedding, looked for fingerprints, searched for signs of forced entry or defensive wounds. They found none that clearly explained what had happened. There were no signs Jennifer had fought back extensively, no bruises on her arms that suggested a prolonged struggle, no broken nails, no displaced furniture. This suggested something uncomfortable. She likely knew her attacker, or she didn't have time to react. Both possibilities pushed the investigation in very specific directions. Attention turned immediately to Jennifer's personal life, her recent divorce, custody disputes, text messages, emails, call logs. Michael Hartsock, her ex-husband, was interviewed that same day. He cooperated. He answered questions. He provided his whereabouts for the night. According to Michael, he had been home alone during the early morning hours. He said he went to bed around midnight and didn't leave his residence. At the time, there was no evidence to directly contradict him. The estimated time of death was placed between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., a wide window that left too much room for interpretation. And because no one had anchored the timeline to anything solid yet, the investigation floated inside that uncertainty. Meanwhile, the apartment complex itself was treated as background. Officers walked the grounds briefly. They looked for signs of forced access. They checked the garage superficially. Nothing stood out. The gate was noted as functional. No one tested it. No one timed it. No one asked how often it moved overnight. Because by daylight, the sound was gone. Sound leaves no visible trace. Once it stops, it becomes memory. And memory is unreliable unless something forces it into focus. By late afternoon, the complex returned to an uneasy quiet. Residents went back inside. The tape stayed up around Jennifer's door. The rest of the building looked unchanged. Inside the apartment, investigators worked late into the evening. Outside, life resumed. And somewhere between those two realities, the sealed crime scene and the untouched garage entrance, the most accurate marker of time from the night before remained unrecognized: the harmless noise. At this stage, investigators believed they were looking for a person who entered Jennifer's apartment unnoticed, committed murder without leaving clear evidence, and vanished without being seen. They didn't yet understand that the environment had already recorded that person's movement. They just didn't know how to listen for it. Because when a murder is discovered after the fact, investigators naturally focus on what can still be seen, and what can no longer be heard is often dismissed as gone forever. But the sound from that night wasn't gone. It was waiting. And what happened next changed everything. Once the medical examiner confirmed homicide, the investigation moved quickly, but not necessarily in the right direction. By the evening of June 13, 2008, detectives had already begun building a narrative. Not because they were careless, but because human minds seek structure when confronted with chaos. A story helps organize facts. It gives direction. And in criminal investigations, direction determines where resources go. The first assumptions formed quietly. Jennifer Hartsock had been recently divorced. There were unresolved custody issues. There was emotional tension. That alone didn't imply violence, but it framed the lens through which everything else was viewed. Detectives focused on motive, not mechanics. They interviewed Jennifer's co-workers again, this time with sharper questions. Did she seem afraid? Was she stressed? Did she mention arguments or threats? Most answers were vague. Jennifer had been tired, they said, preoccupied, nothing alarming. Friends were asked similar questions. Some remembered frustration about custody schedules. Others mentioned financial strain, normal post-divorce complications. Nothing that pointed clearly to murder. Michael Hartsock, her ex-husband, became the center of attention by default. He had motive, at least on paper. He had access. He knew her routines. He had keys at one point, though he claimed they had been returned. He was questioned again on June 14th, then again on June 16th. Each time, his story remained consistent. He said he was home the night Jennifer was killed. He said he didn't leave. He said he slept through the night. Investigators checked what they could. Phone records showed no outgoing calls from his phone during the window of interest, no texts, no activity that placed him elsewhere. But phone inactivity is not proof of presence. At the same time, there was no direct evidence placing him at Jennifer's apartment either. The investigation began to stall almost immediately, not because there were no leads, but because the leads didn't converge. Without forced entry, detectives assumed Jennifer either let someone in or the person had access. Without signs of struggle, they assumed surprise or familiarity. Those assumptions narrowed the field quickly, but narrowing too early can blind an investigation. They spent hours reconstructing Jennifer's final day. They mapped her movements. They reviewed store receipts, emails, and calendar entries. Everything pointed to a normal Thursday. Nothing suggested she was expecting danger. Meanwhile, the environment where movement had occurred was left mostly unexamined. The garage was considered secure, the gate functioned, cameras covered some angles. There was no reason, investigators thought, to believe the killer used that entrance. They assumed entry happened through the front door. That assumption mattered because once it settled, it shaped the rest of the case. They looked for fingerprints on doorknobs. They tested locks. They examined whether anyone could have entered without leaving marks. They did not ask whether someone could have entered and exited through the garage without being seen. They did not ask what the garage sounded like at night. They did not ask residents about repeated noises because they weren't looking for patterns. They were looking for events. This distinction is subtle, but critical. Events are dramatic. They stand out. They feel like answers. Patterns are quiet. They require patience. In the first weeks, investigators followed what they believed were the strongest leads. They requested additional forensic analysis. They consulted profilers. They reviewed similar cases in the area. Nothing matched cleanly. The estimated time of death remained broad. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., that 3-hour window made it difficult to exclude or confirm anyone definitively. And without a tighter timeline, suspicion lingered, but proof did not. As pressure mounted, investigators began to rely more heavily on probability than certainty. Statistically, they knew who was most likely to be responsible, but statistics don't hold up in court. They needed something solid, something measurable, something that didn't depend on memory or interpretation. What they didn't realize was that they already had it. The harmless noise, the gate, had occurred at a specific moment. It had a duration. It had a mechanical cause. But because it didn't look like evidence, it wasn't treated as such. This happens more often than people realize. Investigations are shaped by expectations. Investigators listen for what they believe matters. When something falls outside that expectation, it's filtered out. Not maliciously, but unconsciously. The gate noise didn't match the internal model of a murder clue. So, it stayed invisible. By late June 2008, the case began to slow. Media interest faded, leads dried up. The investigation didn't stop, but it stopped moving forward. Jennifer's family grew frustrated. Friends demanded answers. Detectives continued working, but without new information, progress was incremental at best. And throughout all of this, the gate kept doing what it always did. It opened. It closed. It made its sound. Residents continued to hear it at night and forget it by morning. No one thought to document when it happened. No one thought to correlate it with anything else. No one except one person. Detective Jerry Demings, reviewing the file weeks later, noticed something small, a repetition. Several witnesses mentioned a noise. Not the same words, not the same emphasis, just references. Metal, gate, like always. Most investigators would have dismissed that as coincidence. Demings didn't. He didn't know yet what it meant. He didn't know if it meant anything at all. But he recognized something important. The noise was consistent, and consistency in a case full of uncertainty was rare. So he asked a question no one else had asked yet. What if the most important moment of the night wasn't something dramatic, but something routine? And that's when the investigation began to shift. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand why the noise was ignored, you have to understand how people decide what matters. It wasn't negligence, it wasn't laziness, and it wasn't stupidity. It was psychology. When Detective Jerry Demings began rereading the interview transcripts in late July 2008, he wasn't looking for a breakthrough. He was looking for consistency, something stable in a case that had become unstable almost immediately. Most of what he read was familiar, emotional accounts, contradictions. Gaps explained away by stress or poor memory. That's normal in homicide cases, especially when there are no direct witnesses. But what caught his attention wasn't a dramatic statement. It was repetition. Multiple witnesses, independent of one another, had mentioned a sound, always briefly, always without emphasis, always framed as irrelevant. A gate. Metal. Noise. Each time, it was followed by the same dismissal. That happens all the time. Demings understood why that mattered, because when the brain labels something as routine, it stops processing it as information. This is called habituation. It's how humans survive environments filled with constant sensory input. You stop hearing traffic. You stop noticing the hum of appliances. You stop reacting to familiar sounds because reacting would be exhausting. The garage gate had become part of that background. By 2008, the residents of the Timberline Drive complex had heard it hundreds, possibly thousands of times. It didn't signal danger. It didn't precede problems. It didn't demand action. So, when it appeared in witness statements, it was automatically minimized, even by investigators. Police are trained to prioritize deviation, shouts, crashes, sudden silence. Those things suggest disruption. The gate did the opposite. It suggested continuity, and continuity feels safe. Another factor made the noise easy to ignore: lack of ownership. No one felt responsible for it. The gate wasn't inside Jennifer's apartment. It wasn't inside anyone's personal space. It belonged to the building, to management, to infrastructure. When something doesn't belong to a person, people assume someone else will notice if it matters. That assumption creates blind spots. During early interviews, detectives didn't follow up on the sound because they weren't trained to treat infrastructure noise as evidence. It wasn't tied to emotion. It wasn't tied to behavior. It was mechanical. And mechanical details are often treated as secondary unless they clearly malfunction. The gate still opened, it's still closed, it's still locked. From a functional standpoint, it wasn't broken. From an evidentiary standpoint, it was invisible. Another reason the noise was dismissed lies in how questions were asked. Witnesses were asked, "Did you hear anything unusual? Did you hear any disturbance?" Those questions frame memory in a very specific way. They encourage people to scan for contrast. The gate did not contrast with anything. It blended, so witnesses filtered it out before answering. Even Marissa Cole, whose arrival time would later prove critical, almost didn't mention it at all. When she did, she framed it as irrelevant, not because she was hiding something, but because she genuinely believed it was meaningless. And investigators accepted that framing. This is an uncomfortable truth about criminal cases. Evidence does not announce itself. It has to be interpreted. The noise was present in the record from the beginning. It wasn't discovered later. It wasn't hidden. It was just overlooked. By August 2008, the case had cooled significantly. Investigators still worked it, but without urgency. There were no new forensic leads, no new witnesses. The timeline remained wide. The suspect pool remained narrow. The evidence remained circumstantial. And the gate remained noisy. It continued to open and close every day. Residents continued to hear it and forget it, until Demings decided to stop asking why people heard it and started asking when. He requested maintenance logs for the gate, not because he suspected the gate itself, but because he wanted to understand its behavior. Those logs revealed something subtle. The gate could not open on a timer. It could not open automatically without a vehicle present, and it could not open silently. Any opening, entry, or exit produced the same metallic scraping noise. That meant something crucial. If the gate moved, someone was there. And if someone was there at a specific time, that movement could anchor the timeline in a way witness memory could not. This was the first moment the noise shifted categories, from background to marker. Demings ordered a reconstruction. They tested the gate multiple times, measuring sound duration and volume from various apartments. They recorded it, timed it, compared it to witness descriptions. The results were consistent. The sound lasted between 11 and 13 seconds. It was audible in at least 6 apartments surrounding the garage. It could not be mistaken for anything else when played back. What had once been dismissed as meaningless repetition became measurable data. And with data came structure. Suddenly, the sound wasn't just noise. It was a timestamp. and timestamps are dangerous to lies. But at this stage, Deming still hadn't proven anything. He had only confirmed one thing: the gate didn't lie. And that's when the case began to shift from assumptions to mechanics, from psychology to physics. Because while people forget, machines repeat. And repetition is hard to argue with. What happened next changed everything. By the beginning of September 2008, the case was officially described as inactive, though no one used the word cold out loud. Files were still open, evidence was still stored, but momentum was gone. This is the stage where many investigations quietly fail, not because the truth is unreachable, but because nothing new is allowed to enter the system. Detectives had followed the obvious paths. They had interviewed family, friends, co-workers. They had reviewed phone records, emails, and financial activity. They had searched Jennifer Hartsock's apartment repeatedly, hoping something overlooked would suddenly announce itself. Nothing did. The absence of forced entry continued to dominate the narrative. It pushed investigators toward a narrow set of possibilities: someone Jennifer trusted, someone with access, or someone skilled enough to leave no trace. That framework excluded a wide range of scenarios before they were ever fully explored. And once exclusions are made, attention shifts away. This is how cases stall, not with a single mistake, but with a series of reasonable decisions that slowly remove flexibility. By this point, Detective Jerry Demings was one of the few people still actively questioning the foundation of the case, rather than its details. He wasn't convinced the problem was missing evidence. He suspected the problem was misclassified evidence. The gate noise, now identified as consistent, measurable, and unavoidable, had created a new axis of analysis, but introducing it into the case required undoing weeks of assumptions, and that's not easy. When Deming suggested that the garage gate could provide a precise movement marker, there was resistance, not open opposition, but hesitation. Because if the gate mattered, then the original timeline was wrong. And if the timeline was wrong, then conclusions drawn from it were unstable. That meant starting over. In institutional investigations, starting over is expensive. It consumes time, resources, and credibility. It also forces investigators to confront the possibility that they missed something early on. So, progress slowed. Demings didn't push publicly. He worked quietly. He requested additional witness interviews, not to ask new questions, but to ask the same questions differently. Instead of asking, "Did you hear anything unusual?" he asked, "What sounds do you remember hearing that night?" Even if they felt normal, the difference was subtle, but the effect was immediate. Residents began to recall the gate more clearly, not just that they heard it, but when they heard it in relation to their own routines. One resident remembered hearing it just before brushing his teeth. Another recalled it while checking the time on her phone before sleep. These anchors weren't precise, but they were consistent. The sound clustered around a narrow window, between 2:10 a.m. and 2:35 a.m. That window overlapped almost perfectly with Marissa Cole's documented arrival time, which meant the sound wasn't random, it was singular, one entry, one exit, and that raised a question investigators hadn't asked yet. If the killer entered through the garage, why hadn't anyone seen a vehicle? The answer was uncomfortable. They hadn't been looking. The garage cameras didn't cover the exterior track. They covered interior parking rows. If someone parked briefly, exited on foot, and re-entered later, the cameras might not capture enough to raise suspicion. And because no one believed the garage was involved, no one reviewed footage with that possibility in mind. The case had stalled because investigators were trying to solve it using human behavior alone, motives, emotions, relationships. But the crime itself had relied on infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't carry intent. But it creates opportunity. The sound of the gate was the sound of opportunity opening and closing. As this realization took shape, the case shifted quietly back into motion. Investigators re-examined Michael Hartsock's alibi, not by asking where he claimed to be, but by asking where he could physically have been given the gate's timing. The problem with alibis is that they often rely on absence of contradiction rather than proof. Michael had said he stayed home, but no one had proven he didn't leave. The gate's timing narrowed the window of possibility to a span of minutes. And within that span, something didn't align. Phone records showed no activity, but that now worked against him. Because the movement implied by the gate didn't require a phone, It required presence. By mid-September, investigators requested additional analysis: vehicle access logs, parking patterns, gate usage frequency. They weren't chasing a theory anymore. They were testing a mechanism. And mechanisms don't respond to persuasion. They respond to constraints. The case had stalled because it was being asked the wrong questions. Once the questions changed, the answers began to surface, not loudly, but steadily. The sound that had once been dismissed as meaningless now defined the narrowest, most reliable window of the crime. And with that window came pressure, because if the gate marked movement, then whoever moved through it had to account for it. And some explanations couldn't. That's when the silence around the case finally broke. Not with an arrest, not with a confession, but with the realization that the murder had always left a trace, just not the kind people were listening for. And that's when things took a darker turn. What made the noise so difficult to understand wasn't just that it had been ignored, it was that it never stopped. In the weeks after Jennifer Hartsock's murder, life at the Timberline Drive complex returned to something resembling normal. Police cars disappeared, crime scene tape was removed, residents stopped whispering in stairwells, and the gate kept moving. Every day, every night, it opened, it closed, it scraped along its warped track exactly the same way it always had. That continuity mattered, because if the noise had only occurred once, on the night of the murder, it would have been easier to notice, easier to isolate, easier to remember. But it didn't. It blended back into the environment immediately, dissolving into routine. This is where timing becomes deceptive. Human memory anchors itself to change. We remember the first time something happens, or the last, or the moment it's different, but we don't remember what repeats without variation. For residents, the sound after June 13th felt no different than the sound before it. There was no way to distinguish the gate opening during a murder from the gate opening on an ordinary night, and that created a dangerous illusion, because continuity feels like innocence. In late June and early July 2008, investigators returned to the complex several times. They canvassed again. They asked follow-up questions. They walked the grounds at night. They heard the gate. But hearing it in daylight, or during an active investigation, stripped it of context. Without the emotional weight of the crime, the sound was just sound. It didn't feel connected. This is a critical moment in many unsolved cases. When evidence continues to exist after a crime, it loses its perceived uniqueness. It no longer feels tied to that moment. Investigators heard the noise after the murder and unconsciously thought, if this were important, it wouldn't still be happening. That assumption is common and wrong, because some evidence isn't created by the crime, it's revealed by it. The gate noise wasn't produced because of the murder. It was produced despite it. It was always there. The crime just happened to pass through it. By July 2008, several residents mentioned the gate casually in unrelated maintenance complaints. One called it annoying. Another said it woke their baby sometimes. Management logged these complaints without urgency. No one connected them to the homicide file. The sound continued to mark entries and exits, each one identical, each one blending into the next. This is where the investigation almost lost its chance entirely, because once enough time passes, even consistent markers become statistically meaningless. They drown in their own repetition. If Demings hadn't intervened when he did, the gate would have remained just another background feature. Instead, he made a deliberate choice. He decided to treat the noise not as an event, but as a system. Systems behave predictably. On August 18, 2008, investigators conducted a full overnight observation of the garage, not to catch a suspect, but to understand normal behavior. They logged every gate activation from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. They recorded time of activation, duration of sound, vehicle presence, direction of movement. The results were revealing. On a typical night, the gate activated between 12 and 18 times, mostly clustered around early evening and early morning. Almost all activations coincided with visible vehicle movement. Almost. There were 2 activations during that observation period where no vehicle was immediately visible on camera. In both cases, the gate opened and closed within seconds. Too short for parking, too short for loitering, consistent with someone entering or exiting on foot. This detail had never been documented before, because no one had thought to. The gate wasn't just noisy, it was permissive. Once open, it allowed access to the interior of the complex without passing through the front entrances of the apartment buildings. From there, stairwells led directly to second-floor units, including Jennifer's. This challenged the earlier assumption that the front door was the only plausible entry point. And it explained something else investigators hadn't been able to reconcile: why no one had seen anything. If the killer entered through the garage, walked inside, and exited the same way, they could avoid almost all casual observation. No neighbors, no cameras, no attention, just sound. And sound is easy to ignore. What made this especially unsettling was how often the same pattern occurred after the murder. Residents continued to hear the gate at night, sometimes at 2 a.m., sometimes later, sometimes earlier. None of those activations were crimes, but one of them had been. And there was no audible difference. This realization reframed the case in a quiet but profound way. The murder hadn't disrupted the environment had absorbed it. By early September, Demings ordered historical analysis, maintenance logs, gate repair records, any documentation that could confirm the gate's behavior months before and after June 13th. The findings confirmed what witnesses had said all along. The sound was consistent. The duration was consistent. The defect had not changed, which meant the sound heard on the night of the murder was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, and patterns can be measured. The noise continued, but now investigators were listening differently, not for meaning, for timing. They began aligning gate activations with known movements of people connected to the case: work schedules, travel times, documented receipts. Slowly, a picture began to form, not of chaos, but of precision. Because the gate didn't just make noise, it made limits on who could have been there, limits on when, limits on how. The harmless sound that once dissolved into the night had become the most reliable witness in the case. It didn't remember, it didn't forget, it didn't change its story, it just repeated it, over and over, and the more it repeated, the harder it became for the truth to hide. What happened next changed everything. The moment someone finally mentioned the noise as more than background did not happen in an interrogation room. It happened during a routine follow-up call. On September 22, 2008, Detective Jerry Demings contacted Marissa Cole again. By that point, she had already spoken to police twice. Her statements were consistent. She had arrived home late. She had heard the garage gate. She had gone inside and gone to sleep. Nothing about her account had raised suspicion. This call wasn't accusatory. It wasn't urgent. It was procedural. Demings asked her to walk through that night one more time, slowly. Not what she did, but what she noticed, what she heard, what she saw, what felt normal. At first, the answers were the same. Then Demings asked a different question. Can you remember whether the gate opened once or twice? There was a pause. Marissa hadn't been asked that before. She said she remembered the sound clearly. She remembered it because it annoyed her. It always did. The metal scraping against metal, the way it echoed. But once or twice. She wasn't sure. So Demings didn't push. Instead, he asked her to anchor the sound to something physical. What were you doing when you heard it? She said she had just parked. She remembered grabbing her bag. She remembered looking at her phone because she was tired and wanted to see how late it was. Her phone records confirmed that. She had checked the time at 2:27 a.m. That detail had been in the file since June, but now it mattered. Demings asked another question. After you heard the gate, did you see any cars moving? Marissa said no. She said she assumed someone had come in behind her on foot. That sometimes happened. People followed cars in. It wasn't unusual. She had never said that part out loud before, not because she was hiding it, because no one had asked. That statement changed the tone of the call. For the first time, the gate wasn't just a sound in her memory. It was a moment of access. That same week, Demings re-interviewed two other residents whose apartments overlooked the garage entrance. One remembered hearing the gate while watching late-night television. Another remembered it while getting up to use the bathroom. Both placed it between 2:20 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Neither had seen a car. Each had assumed the sound meant nothing. This convergence was subtle, but it was the first time multiple accounts aligned around the same moment. Until then, witness timelines had drifted by hours, Now they clustered within minutes. Demings documented everything carefully. No conclusions, no accusations, just alignment. The noise had become a shared reference point, and shared reference points are powerful. They reduce uncertainty. They collapse time. By September 25th, investigators overlaid gate activity with known movements of everyone connected to Jennifer Hartsock. Michael Hartsock's alibi placed him at home. He claimed he hadn't left. He said he slept through the night. But there was no independent confirmation of that. No cameras, no phone usage, no witnesses. What investigators did have was geography. Michael lived less than 8 minutes from Jennifer's apartment, 8 minutes driving, less if traffic was light. And at 2:27 a.m., traffic was non-existent. If he had left his home at 2:15 a.m., entered the garage at 2:27, and exited shortly after, the timeline fit cleanly, too cleanly. This was the first time the case produced a coherent mechanical sequence. Not motive, not emotion, movement. The gate provided entry. The stairwell provided access. The apartment door showed no forced entry. The sound, once ignored, now sat at the center of the timeline like a pin. Investigators did not arrest anyone. They didn't confront Michael, not yet. They understood something critical. Once you reveal your anchor, you lose it. So they worked quietly. They reconstructed the route from Michael's home to Jennifer's garage. They timed it. Multiple times, at night. They tested how long it took to walk from the garage to Jennifer's apartment. They measured stairwell lighting, door distances. Everything fit within the same narrow window. The noise hadn't just been a clue, it had been permission. Permission to move without being seen. The realization settled slowly across the investigation team. They had been waiting for someone to speak up, but the only witness that mattered never would. It was mechanical, unemotional, unaware of consequences. The gate didn't accuse anyone, it just marked presence, and presence is difficult to explain away. By the end of September, the question was no longer who might have killed Jennifer Hartsock. It was who could have moved through that gate at that moment and left no trace. The answer narrowed quickly, and the case, which had once drifted toward silence, now carried a sound no one could ignore. But the most dangerous part of this realization wasn't what it revealed. It was what it forced investigators to do next. Because once you build a case on something that simple, every explanation becomes complicated, and that's when the pressure began to rise. The arrest did not happen quickly. It happened carefully. On November 21st, 2008, nearly 5 months after Jennifer Hartsock was killed, investigators finally moved forward, not because they suddenly found new evidence, but because they had finished removing uncertainty. By that point, the case no longer rested on motive. It rested on movement. Michael Hartsock was taken in for questioning that morning. The interview room was quiet. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just time. Investigators didn't accuse him immediately. They didn't mention the gate. They asked him to describe his night again. He said the same thing he had always said. He went to bed, he stayed home, he slept. Then they asked him about routine, what he did when he couldn't sleep, whether he ever drove at night, whether he ever checked on Jennifer unannounced. Each answer was cautious, controlled. Then they introduced the timeline, not emotionally, mechanically. They told him about the gate. They described its defect, its sound, its duration. They told him witnesses remembered it opening at 2:27 a.m. They told him the gate could not open on its own. They told him there was no vehicle visible, and then they stopped talking. Silence does something people don't expect. It removes performance. Michael didn't confess, not outright. But his story changed. First he said maybe he had stepped outside briefly. Then he said he might have driven, but couldn't remember where. Then he said stress affected his memory. Each shift narrowed the gap. Investigators didn't argue. They didn't need to. The gate didn't change its story. When forensic analysts aligned his statements with travel times, phone inactivity, and the mechanical window created by the gate, there was no remaining ambiguity. On November 24, 2008, Michael Hartsock was formally charged with first-degree murder. At trial, the defense focused on what wasn't there. No eyewitness, no confession, no dramatic moment. The prosecution focused on what was, a sound, a time, a movement. Expert witnesses testified about the gate's mechanics. Jurors listened to recordings of the noise. They heard how unmistakable it was. They were shown timelines, not emotional narratives, but sequences. The jury didn't need to imagine the crime. They only needed to follow it. On June 4th, 2009, Michael Hartsock was convicted. Jennifer Hartsock was 21 years old. There was no dramatic reveal, no shocking twist. Just a realization that the most reliable witness had been present the entire time. It wasn't human. It didn't care. It didn't forget. After the trial, residents at Timberline Drive said the gate sounded different. Not because it changed, but because they did. Every time it opened, people noticed. They paused. They remembered. The sound that once blended into the background now carried weight. It reminded them of how close truth can be, and how easily it can be ignored. There are crimes that are loud. They announce themselves with chaos, violence, and urgency. And then there are crimes like this one, quiet, contained, absorbed into routine. Jennifer Hartsock didn't disappear into darkness. She disappeared into normality, into a building where doors opened and closed every day, into a sound people heard and dismissed, into a system that kept working long after she was gone. The gate didn't solve the case because it was clever. It solved the case because it was consistent. It did the same thing every time, and in a world where memory bends, motives shift, and people protect themselves, consistency becomes truth. Most of us live surrounded by harmless noises: elevators, traffic, doors, machines. We stop hearing them because we need to. But sometimes, those sounds are the only record left behind, not of violence, but of presence. This story isn't about technology solving crime. It's about attention, about what happens when something ordinary is finally taken seriously. Jennifer Hartsock's life ended quietly, but the truth did not. It waited, in the background, doing what it always did,